So Los Angeles is the least affordable rental market in the country, and we've been talking with the folks at Milken for months about how to have conversations around this. We've had a few until now, and this is the sort of capstone event. You know, we're not the most expensive market. That would probably be Silicon Valley, but we are the most unaffordable because people can't afford to live here. Is it a housing problem? Is it a wage problem? Is it a combination of that? How do we get out of it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. We will save a few minutes for questions at the end, so if you have any, please hold on to them, and one of the producers with a microphone will come find you. So joining me is Scott Laurie, President and CEO of Olson Company, Sean Burton, CEO of CityView for our sort of development housing side of the panel, and on the wage and employment side, we have Manuel Pastor, Director of the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity at the University of Southern California, and Vaughn Ton Quinlivan, Vice Chancellor of Workforce and Economic Development for the California Community Colleges. Those are the long titles, these are the short titles. And I'm the Managing Editor of KPCC, so I am not an expert in any of this, I just hopefully ask really good questions. So we're gonna start with housing. Scott, when we talked getting ready for this, we talked about the drop of housing starts after the recession, and why did they seem to have such a huge effect this time around? Like, we've had dips before. Why was this one so significant? What was different?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. What was different coming in and what's been different coming back out, because the housing starts have not come anywhere near the recovery that we would expect at this point in the cycle, which is a very negative trend. As we all know, what led into the recession, a key part of that was the availability of these subprime Alt-A mortgages that got people into homes that they probably should have never been in. And then we went to the polar opposite end, where it became very difficult for anybody to get a home with the underwriting. Where we stand today and what's been different in this recovery, because typically at this point in the cycle, we've seen the housing start coming up. And I don't know if we have that slide that you had, but there was a slide that we were looking at that showed that recovery in housing starts.
Right.
And it's pretty much been non-existent. And there's a couple key components to that, which I think we're going to talk about, is the jobs part of the recovery and where that's occurred.
Yeah.
Incomes are key to that. And one of the great challenges with what we see there is the inability to get entitlements in areas where people want to live, and affordability. Affordability has been one of the greatest challenges in this cycle, and is a challenge whether you are on the public side, the private side. It becomes each year more and more difficult with the rapid appreciation, and what people did not expect in this recovery was the V. So the snapback in pricing happened so quick that people that were thinking about buying a house 2 years ago or even a year ago can no longer afford that house today. And my biggest concern right now, and then I'll stop, is what's going to occur when these interest rates start going back up.
So how much of the housing price run up, and it's not just housing, it's also rentals, as we'll talk about in a minute. So how much of that do you think is due to the fact that we were in an artificially increased market when we began, and how much of it is because housing starts haven't, in your opinion, caught up? Although, I don't know, I see a lot of cranes around town.
So most of those cranes are multifamily.
Yeah.
On the for sale side, you will not see, I wouldn't say any, but very, very few podium builds occur on the for sale side for financing and other reasons attributed to that. But you look at where the pricing has gone in this recovery, and to me that's one of the most unhealthy things that have occurred as we've come into this cycle. And what has occurred is there is a tremendous disparity of wealth. And I think we're in another bubble, and the bubble's on the west side of LA. And you look at where pricing, and I'm living the bubble. I sold my house, just to give a case study, at 35% above peak pricing from last cycle in Santa Monica. It made no sense to me. There is no reason for that to occur. The reason that's occurring, there is no supply. It's a false market. And one thing we know, and I was mentioning this to Sean, I've heard in the last 6 months to a year that this time is different.
Yeah.
I think we all know it's never different. It is, and when I hear that, I think
like
it's
the
6 months.
Abusive, you know, the abusive boyfriend. It's different
this time is different. People are saying, you know, well, you look at pricing in Singapore and Paris and London. I'm sitting there saying,
New York.
Okay, well, look at that, New York, San Francisco. We're here.
Yeah, we're
and
not
so
there.
That, yes, it's challenging.
So entitlements, you both bet my ear about entitlements, Sean. What is wrong with entitlements?
Well, first, let's put slide 4 back up, because I think this is a point that we really need to highlight. This is across the state. And first of all, this is really a tale of two states. Yeah. East of the 5 freeway and west of the 5 freeway. If you're east of the 5 freeway, you don't have the same kind of affordability issues in Bakersfield and Fresno and San Bernardino that you have in the coastal cities. But if you look at this slide, we were building 200, 220, 212,000 units a year, and we dropped 85% to 35,000 units a year. Meanwhile, we're adding 220 to 250,000 households. So it's a simple economics, supply and demand imbalance, which has created on the rental side this terrible affordability issue. Right now, if you make the minimum wage in California, $9 an hour, you have to work 118 hours a week to afford the average rental 2-bedroom apartment. So it's created this very difficult issue. The land prices are very expensive. And then entitlements, California is a challenge, especially in urban markets. You'll hear a lot of talk about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act.
Yeah.
2/3 of CEQA lawsuits are filed against residential housing in cities, near jobs and near transit, exactly where we should be building housing in order to bring down prices. So it's a major, major issue.
Well, that's because the residents and the politicians aren't necessarily in line with what they want to do in the communities, right? So one of the things we talked about is how do you convince people to accept sort of density, multifamily housing in communities that were single-family communities until now? Right. How do you do that?
Well, if you talk to most residents when they're opposing housing projects, they talk about traffic. They say, I don't want more traffic in my neighborhood. I'm tired of sitting in gridlock in Los Angeles. It's awful. But if you have offices and creative offices and traditional office buildings and retail centers, and people live far away from that, because we don't have great mass transit options in Los Angeles, people get in their cars. Yeah. So there's a lot of studies that show if you actually build density near jobs and near transit hubs and near amenities, the traffic goes down and it's a much more kind of livable lifestyle. But it's a lot of people just don't want it in their neighborhood. And also a lot of single family owners feel that if you put in rental apartments, it's going to lower their home values. Mm-hmm. You're going to bring in those people and it's going to lower their home values. And that's been a major issue.
Mm-hmm. So part of the issue is building, so in order to solve the traffic problem, you have to build near employment centers. Are there really places to build near employment centers right now? Do you want to take that?
So I'd be happy to take that. That's our primary focus for the company. We only build in 3 areas, so around downtown LA, around LAX, in that employment corridor, and then down in North Orange County in what we call the OC Metro. So today we're building in San Gabriel, Monterey Park, El Monte, Montebello, Pasadena, Huntington Beach. We just closed a project out in Fountain Valley, Garden Grove, all these areas driven by employment. And can I go back for 1 second? One thing on the permits I think that gets ignored is in the last cycle, people weren't just buying one house. Some people were buying 2, 3, 4, 5. Then they'd get on a plane, Southwest Airlines to Vegas. Let's pick a couple up there and then go to Phoenix. That's not coming back. And when I look back at my career in that time, we were doing 1,500 homes just in the Inland Empire from one public builder. That is not coming back. And so that's a huge part of the housing market that's gone for good reason that I don't see recovering at this point in time. But where we build is where the jobs are. So what you talk about with jobs and incomes and what Sean was just referring to, that is critical. We need to see wage growth because I don't see where that next group is going to be able to afford my projects. And when I look at where I'm building in San Gabriel or Pasadena, affordable for me in Pasadena today is my prices go from $650 to $750.
So that was going to be my next question. How do you guys define affordable? Because it's kind of a term of art. And both of you build market rent, although I know that you have some units, because of inclusionary zoning that might have some low income. But what does someone need to make to buy one of your homes, Scott? What does someone need to make to rent one of your homes, Sean?
Go ahead, you want to start?
Well, to rent one of our apartments, if we're building new apartments, we're a market rate investor and developer. We manage public pension fund capital. We're required to give market returns to the pensioners who entrust us with their money. It's impossible for us in the coastal cities in California to build housing and rent it at affordable rates. You would be underwater. It just can't be done for that. It could cost us $400,000 to $500,000 per unit to build a project in the coastal markets in California. So the only way to do it is to have some sort of government subsidy or to have broad-based incentives. So Senate Bill 1818 was passed a few years ago. We've used that quite a bit, as have others. That gives developers options. You can go higher, you can have more density, you reduce your parking requirements.
Yeah.
That's a major issue for us, because when we're building a new project, if there's an underground garage, it costs $30,000 to $35,000 per space to build that in today's market. And that's with concrete prices and everything going up. So that all has to be subsidized by the renters. So if cities can reduce those parking requirements because you're building near a transit stop, for example, you can bring down the rents and create more affordability.
You didn't actually answer my question of how much someone needs to make to rent. So what does someone need to make to rent an apartment in the LA area? Today, I know you build across the state, but for here locally, what does someone have to make?
I mean, the average, $4,700 a month, according, I was just looking at this fair market rent study from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They're saying it's $4,600 a month to rent an average 2-bedroom apartment, which is about $1,400.
Yeah.
But you're not going to find that on the west side of LA, to Scott's point. You're not going to find that in downtown or Koreatown. It's going to be in the North Valley. It's going to be East LA, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. What does someone need to make to qualify for a loan to buy one of yours?
So typically you're going to be starting at our affordable at $100,000 combined income, which is a lot of money.
Right. We'll keep talking about housing in a minute, but how does that relate to what people make in Los Angeles?
Well, it's one of the reasons why we have one of the least affordable housing markets. It's not simply the price of the housing, but the fact that incomes have really stagnated in Los Angeles. And also it's been part of a sort of broader national trend. I like this. We can actually just call slides up. So slide 12. So slide 12 shows you actually the growth in the wealth gap in the United States since 1980. And you can see that there's been, for the bottom 99%, about a 15% increase in their wealth versus about 137% for those in the top 1%. The level of income inequality in the United States right now is about the same as it was right before the Great Depression. And much of this has been chronicled in that book. How many of you heard of that book by Thomas Piketty, Capital? How many of you read that book? It's interesting. Amazon tells us, because they can track where you are in your Kindle, that was the most unread bestseller they've ever sold. But it stirred a national conversation. But that national conversation actually needs to be, I think, exacerbated here in California. The reason is that by a standard measure of income inequality, something called the Gini coefficient, in 1969, California was basically in the middle of the states. By the last data point, 2013, California is now the fourth most unequal state in the United States. So while income inequality has increased dramatically in the rest of the United States, it's actually increased sort of on steroids here in California. And it's kind of two kinds of inequality that wind up getting confused. And then we can talk about incomes. One is the 1% and everybody else. Right now in California, if you're a 1%er, you make in 1 week what the average Californian makes in 1 year. So there's been a sort of way in which the top 1% has really torn off from the rest of the population. But the other thing that's gone on is what's going on for the 90th and 80th percentile versus the 10th and 20th percentile. Those are the professional middle-class folks you can sell your homes to versus the sort of working poor who are at the bottom of the income distribution. And while that's tilted like this in the last 20 years in the United States, it's tilted like that in California. That is, there's been an even higher premium for those who are at the 80th and 90th percentile of the wage distribution, and even higher wage penalty for those at the bottom in California. So part of what's going on in this housing market is a reflection of this widening income gap, and we can talk a little bit about the solutions that might be needed to address that part as well.
Yeah. And Sean, you have some firsthand stories about how desperate people are to get apartments they can afford.
Yeah, we have a project in Foster City, which is just south of the airport in San Francisco. 166 units, brand new project called Triton Point. We set aside 20% of those units for people who made between 30 and 50% of the area median income. And about 3 weeks ago, we went up with our website and we opened a phone line so that people could call in to get on the list to go through the lottery and the qualification. We had so many calls in the first 24 hours, it literally crashed the phone system and crashed the website. And we had to put a much more robust system in place because people were just desperate to pay $800 or $900 a month for a studio apartment versus $3,000, which is what the market rate will dictate for that.
Yeah.
So it's just, there's so much need out there.
So let's talk a little bit about solutions. So there's been a bunch of, or at least maybe not a bunch, but a handful of things that people are talking about, particularly about how do we build more low-income housing. And so Mayor Garcetti has been sort of wading into the affordable housing debate. He says developers don't pay enough to play in Los Angeles, and he wants to see linkage fees to help pay for affordable housing projects. So, you know, the idea that increasing supply alone, what you guys do, isn't going to do it. We actually need a fund again. I know that there is the point of view that that will be a barrier and that there will be less built, but what if it wasn't? So what if linkage fees came with a speedy process of permitting? You know, what if it came with some kind of incentive? Is that something that you guys see as part of the answer, Scott?
And so I know the mayor's talked about that, but
Yeah.
there's not a plan that sits behind it. And
There's nothing
right.
specific. That's
And there's
right.
other cities that have done that.
Boston, yeah, San Diego.
And I think is the goal 100 million.
He wants to build 100 million units of housing by 2021, I think 15% of which he wants to be affordable.
Right.
Yeah, and this is part of his plan to do it.
Which I think is great. There's a lot of work to actually implement that. So
Yeah.
for us to pay a linkage fee, I have no issue with that. I would support that. That is another pass-through that's going back on the private side for a land acquisition
Yeah.
to the land seller.
Right.
If I'm underwriting to a margin, and the margin doesn't change, what
Right.
changes is what I'm going to pay for the land.
Right.
So it's just another exaction or fee to the community. I think if you could tie that to an expedited entitlement, because right now, affordable in Highland Park, we're doing a new community in Highland Park that's
Yeah.
affordable, and that's going to be in the 5s and 6s.
Yeah.
For me, I would rather have the project in the 300s. In just 2011, I was able to sell homes in the 300s.
That's right.
That's not there anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that it is up to, I like that Mayor Garcetti's going down that path.
Yeah.
Push it back into the developers. What I think some people come to the realization, the developers always find a way. So
Right.
the fees
Well, I mean,
always
is
get
it
increased.
getting pushed into developers or is it getting pushed into the landowners, right?
Well,
Because if it's the fee
coming
on everybody.
through it's a
yeah.
funnel.
Yeah.
Someone's getting it somewhere.
That's right.
And at the end of the day, it takes care of that missing component, which was just discussed.
Yeah.
Because my concern is, where are all these people going to live?
Yeah.
Where is that workforce? Our whole business model, we go and look where people are with the jobs and incomes. And we can't find enough of those jobs and incomes for the homes that we're building. That is one of the greatest challenges that I face in my business today. And 2.5, 3 years ago, I was trying to bring the price down. So now I'm in La Mirada, La Habra, Harbor Gateway, Downey, Buena Park. But now all of a sudden I'm in Buena Park, where I was looking at that was supposed to be in the 3s and 4s. Buena Park today is in the 500s, and I've seen a response in the 500s for market rate houses, like you're talking about in Forest City, for a rental affordable program. So
Because of the price of
yeah,
land.
and there's nothing out there. And that's where the cities, and sorry to dwell on this, but it's an aggravating topic to me.
Yeah.
The cities limit themselves. They do. And part of it is that there
Because
is
of limitations on what you can build, because of height
because of
restrictions.
an unwillingness on certain cities' parts. So today I'm building affordables in Pasadena. I'm building affordables in Huntington Beach. There are many cities out there where the city staff would like to see higher density, more affordable projects, communities, but there is a disconnect between staff and council. And many of these councils out there, and it doesn't matter to me, it won't hurt me, but San Dimas, we were looking to do a higher density, more affordable project. We had actually done affordable homes in San Dimas. We went back in, we were rezoning a community. They said, go down this path. We went down this path. We spent, which we talked about, the entitlements are expensive. We spent $1.8 million just to see if we could do this. We got to council, and council said, absolutely not. In fact, not only are we not going to allow this, we will upzone these areas to make sure that's not done again.
If I might add one thing, I think Scott's made a series of important points, one of which you made early and got a little bit buried, which is that we need to consider the need for a balanced workforce, because the idea is somehow we're going to have these high-tech centers, people have a lot of money, they'll be able to afford this really expensive housing. But behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners food service workers, low-skilled jobs that actually complement. You see this in the Silicon Valley, you see it in Silicon Beach, you see it in Austin, et cetera. And we're not thinking about how to improve their standard of living. We can talk a little bit about that, or how we actually couple affordable housing so that low-skilled people, low-wage workers,
And the standard of
live
living
close.
for their children.
Yes.
Well,
through
not to
education.
mention that the tech jobs, don't come, the tech boom doesn't come with as many jobs, at least here in Southern California, as we think it does.
It doesn't actually in Northern California either. It's only in the last year or two that the jobs in Silicon Valley went back up to the level that they were in 2000. There's a huge increase in GDP in the Silicon Valley, but the employment picture has not caught up as much.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's all technology. Sean, linkage fees?
Well, I think, as we talked about supply, from our perspective, supply is the number one issue. You need to focus on building more of it. So if you make it more affordable to build, I think my concern would be that would have the opposite of the intended effect. There's other ways to do it. For example, San Francisco just passed Prop A, which is a $310 million affordable housing bond to help support and create affordable housing and to match tax credits. And we believe any solution's got to be broad-based. I think all too often, we have to do our part in the real estate community and development community, but it's not just our issue. Like to say, the real estate community, you alone need to solve affordable housing's like saying, people go hungry in this state, and the way to fix it is the restaurants have to take all the burden of it. We believe that it's got to be a broad-based solution with local governments, with bonds. There's been talk of a $75 fee every time you record a document in California for businesses, for single-family homes. The realtors hate it, but that's one way you could generate and create a permanent source of revenue so you could match bonds.
Yeah.
But we're believers that it has to be a broad-based and incentive-based solution versus just a simple one.
And you prefer inclusionary zoning anyway to this sort of, you say it's inefficient to sort of make a tax to then build affordable housing.
I think, an incentive that says you can have more density if you agree to put 5 or 10 or 20% of the units affordable. Maybe all those don't have to be on site. You can put some of those in a separate building, for example. Incentives like that, we've seen make a lot of sense. Our projects that we have in San Francisco and Foster City in the Bay Area, a lot of those have 10 to 20% affordable units, and they're successful for our investors, and they create a true mixed income project. And when you go to those, you can't tell a affordable apartment from a market rate apartment. They look exactly the same. They have the same finishes. They're similar sizes. They're not in one part of the building. We don't do that thing where you put a separate entrance and you try to, put people in one area. We completely mix it, and those projects have been very successful. The difference is we knew about that going into the project. The land seller knew about that going into the project. So we were able to pay a more market rate price for the land and develop accordingly. But it's that transparency and predictability that's really important.
But then the downside of those is that those agreements run out, right? I mean, I think there's 15,000 units in the city of Los Angeles that are going to run out in about 5 years. Those contracts on affordability are going to run out. So you can't quite create 15,000 units in a minute. So that is the downside of that.
Right, that is a downside. But if you created flexibility for developers and said, we'll give you these incentives, but not only do you need to build 5 new units in your project, but you need to preserve 10 more elsewhere, right? If you gave that kind of flexibility, I think we would figure out a way to do it. But those rules change on every single project.
Well, right, and that's part of the joy of doing business in Los Angeles County, right? Where there are so many different governments,
that's
so many different rules. Yeah, I don't think we're going to fix that one today. Okay, so that brings us on to wages. When we talked earlier, Manuel, you mentioned that there are a number of solutions, that there isn't just one solution, that there are a couple things three things that need to change in order to solve them.
Well, on the wages side, I think in general this idea of rescuing the California dream, policies for an affordable future, it's wrong of us to think that there's one solution, either affordable housing or education or job training, et cetera. On the sort of income side, I think that it's important to put together 3 things that people often tend to think are incompatible. One is to, promote overall economic growth. Unless the economy is thriving, people don't do well. That means paying some attention to where we have some comparative advantages, driving those things, et cetera. The second is to make sure that you can grow the middle class, and that means thinking about career trajectories. That is, jobs that actually move into jobs that will be more sustainable in the future. That's a lot of what Vaughn will talk about. It's a lot of what the community college is trying to do. And then the third thing is to lift up the bottom of the labor market. I'm actually heartened by the fact that the state of California has raised its minimum wage, and heartened by the fact that Los Angeles City and County have moved forward, along with the Bay Area, on raising the minimum wage as well. We need to do all three of those things at the same time. We wind up thinking that those are incompatible, but if you do them right, you can actually bring them together. And we haven't been able to solve the problem at the bottom of the labor market except through trying to increase the minimum wage. We need to make sure that there's trajectories for people to be able to move into the middle class, and we need to make sure that the economy is buoyant moving forward. One key thing in all of that is education.
Yeah.
It's probably a good handoff for Vaughn right now.
Yeah.
Big segue.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. California, the educational level in California is, and of course I'm not going to find my talking point on that right now, it's not what it should be. Vaughn, as what your work in community colleges, you talk about kids in high school not really understanding that there are pathways to good paying jobs that don't require a four-year degree. So first talk about why that disconnect. Why don't people know what's available?
Well, before I answer that question, maybe I can set some context what has happened in the world of workforce and really the gateway into the world of work. A friend had said, once we talked about the industrial economy, and then the industrial economy moved to a knowledge economy, and he would argue, and I would argue as well, that we're actually moving into the retraining economy. And that's driven by a number of factors, and I'm just going to list some trends that are happening. Over the last 3.5 decades, the country grew 63 million new jobs, 63 million new jobs. But if you have a high school degree or less, you actually had 2 million less jobs available to you. So actually the gateway into the world of work has shifted. It used to be okay to be able to bring home be able to feed the family coming out with a high school degree, but now the new gateway is what we call some level of college. 65% of future jobs will require this level of credentialing. Now, this is not necessarily the bachelor level. Yeah. There's a whole area called middle skill, where you have to have more than a high school degree, but less than a baccalaureate, a bachelor. So that could be the area of certificates, associate's degrees, and industry-recognized credentials. And we see this in addition to a phenomenon that happened in the last downturn. And it was that recession was very different from prior recession and ties into this issue of technology. Usually in a downturn, companies have productivity at this level, and then in the downturn they have to lay off and their productivity would go down. In this last recession, companies adopted technology and kept their productivity, and while they laid off workers. And so the number of workers and their productivity became decoupled. And so as you can imagine, the imperative to go back and train is so much more significant nowadays because the shelf life of your knowledge and skill is much shorter than it was before. So as you think about these phenomena affecting you and your neighbors and the communities, it's really important to think about what are the skills you build in choosing the right pathway and into the right credentials. Now, Evelyn asked me to rattle off a few of the earning power of some of these community college certificates and associate's degree. And little known are the area of career technical education. So this is for 2 years of investment or less, all right? So this is what do the average community college student, actual earning, on average, earn 5 years after they earn these degrees or certificates? So in health and information coding, we're hitting 61,000. In health cardiovascular technicians, 73,000. Paramedics, 93,000. Electrical and power line transmission, $137,000. I mean, these are very good returns, and I'm sure everybody, even in this room, would acknowledge for the level of investment, but they're little known. as an option, as a good option in higher education. So what has been the emphasis on the public policy now is to look at career technical education as a strategy, as a pathway out of poverty, because you actually need to break 60,000 for a family of 4 to reside in California. And career technical education options on average bring 68,500 in average earnings 5 years afterwards.
So that's a real salary, and that's why is it that the schools aren't sent? I mean, so are there classes that are going empty? You know, you talk about how enough kids aren't doing it, enough people aren't understanding the programs that are available. Do you have classrooms sitting empty, or is there going to be a supply issue to sort of creating the capacity to educate all these children in these careers?
Well, as educated as this room is, I would imagine, let me put out there, how many of you know what health informatics is? Oh, good, good, good. Medical tomography. All right, I got only one there. There's a whole world of careers that have grown out, and most of our communities are not aware that these are options that exist. So it is actually going to take a multi-sector effort between the community, the public, the private, all of the sectors coming together to ensure that not only those that are young, but those of us who transition later in our careers know what are the occupations that are in demand within your region.
For second and third and fourth careers we're going to all have.
That's right. Evelyn was surprised when I said the average number of careers nowadays is actually 7. 7.
I've had one.
I'm a professor with tenure, so I've got like super job. But I think what people don't realize about the economy, if you listen to a lot of those sectors, those are the health sectors, and health is growing. Why? Because of the aging of the population.
Right.
The other thing that people don't really realize is that we're insourcing manufacturing. One of the bright spots in a very slow recovery has been the manufacturing sector. Yeah. And a lot of people in the manufacturing sector, businesses are clamoring for folks who have talent to replace the folks who are retiring, who are older. And this is actually...
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned that that there are those middle-class jobs, and that is where employers are most looking for people and most unable to find them.
They are unable to find them, and I think that, again, we need to be thinking about growing the economy, which is figuring out what these sectors are, thinking about what the career trajectories are in them, and also lifting up the bottom of the labor market at the same time. And this is incredibly important right now for the following reason, and this is why the community colleges are so important, particularly for kids of color in California. In 1950, the United States had what we would normally think of as an age pyramid. Lots of young people, less people in the middle age. As you got to the old age, something happens, right? Now, as you move from 1950 to 2060, we're moving into an age cylinder. More old people are surviving, there's less young people being born, and although in the current political atmosphere you would think we're being deluged by immigrants, in fact immigration into the country has slowed down dramatically. What that means is that every young person coming up actually has to be a lot more productive to support those of us who are going to retire than in the past, right? So what we really need to do is to be making these investments in young folks and in these kind of careers so that people can do well, and in fact we can do well as a state and not simply as a set of individuals.
Yeah, but retiring or not retiring, Fawn, you were approached at a recent event on employment by KPCC by some people who were in the boomer generation and were looking for career advice, yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, with the community colleges, it's open to 100% of our population instead of, as compared to some of our elite schools that are by application. So you can come to the community colleges when you're 18, when you're 38, when you're 48, when you're 58. And what was interesting to me in that forum was there were a significant population of boomers who came up to me asking questions afterward. How did they re-engage with the labor market and in what areas? And I think this would be an interesting topic for you, Evelyn, to take up and help the boomers understand the evolving world of work, especially once you have some seasoning under your belt, but don't want to start from scratch.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we've been able to have pretty slow job growth but still have an unemployment rate that's got down to 5% is because the labor market participation rate has declined dramatically. And a lot of that is the consequence of long-term unemployment, people getting discouraged. It's certainly happening for young folks not able to get into the labor market, but it's happened to boomers who've been disconnected as well.
Well, and it's worse in LA County than the rest of the state. What's our rate? Is it 6.3 versus 5 for the state?
In terms of unemployment, but also in terms of labor. We actually have a fairly high rate of labor force participation in Los Angeles. Why? We've got so many immigrants, and they've got very high rates of labor force participation because they have no choice but to work. But for the rest of the country and for the state as a whole, this decline in labor force participation has been a big part of the negative aspects of the recovery.
So immigration and education and sort of, Vaughn, have you thought about or have you had discussions about sort of how do we engage with immigrant communities to make these opportunities available or to let them know that the opportunities are available?
Right. I know in the last round of federal discussions around immigration, there was a policies being advocated where as a condition of staying in the U.S., there would be an integration with education.
That's right.
And so as we think about those type of policies to help Californians be more productive and be more skilled, it's important to, in parallel, make sure that the capacity exists in the institutions to bring them into the institutions and provide that training. So those are the, you know, you want to kind of the yin and yang of our policies. Want to think about.
So capacity. So some of these classrooms you're talking about for some of these degrees are incredibly complex. So you have a sort of a mock emergency room for one of the programs?
Yes. So we're dealing with the issue of the cost of providing career technical education. So imagine yourself back in the days when you were taking English. You know, what did it take for you to take that class? I imagine you have, you know, a blackboard, you know, or whiteboard, and some books, right? To train someone in the field of emergency medical technician, which, by the way, you're coming out 5 years later, you're in the 70K, 80K, 90K range, you actually have to build the full simulation of an emergency room, right? With dummies that can talk, that can emote, that tell you when they're in pain, so that you're simulating an actual environment in order for somebody to be truly skilled. Now, you could have a lower cost option where they can read about the emergency situation, but as you know, it's very different to read about it versus to be in it and to be skilled in that situation. So we've been having a set of strong workforce conversations to really look at the cost of career technical education, making sure that we set up the capacity, because in some of these areas, as you mentioned in healthcare, when you have, it now requires credential. No credential means no interview means no job, right? So you're talking about really just who can get the jobs and who cannot by also thinking through the capacity and where you put capacity.
Yeah, and so this is expensive. So who pays for it? Does business pay for it? Does government pay for it? Do taxes pay for it? Who pays for the increasing the capacity so we can have more people with those certificates who can get that training for those middle class jobs?
Well, where we're moving is the action is going to be at the regional level, because these programs are inherently expensive, and what industry wants is not a worker starting out, but a specialized worker. So as you can imagine, that's very expensive for a college to have every single specialty at their single college. So as we say, action is the regional level. Can you take the 18 colleges of the LA region, for example? They can all share the same common core sequence into the health career field, but college A has specialty 1, college B has specialty 2, college C has specialty 3, and the students can move around and pick their specialty. So that's the type of regional coordination that we would like to see as a way to deal with costs and to be able to stretch the dollar and ensure that students are portable within the region.
Yeah. Education and funding, Prop 13 comes up.
Oh, thanks you for the very uncontroversial topic. So let me say a framing thing first, and then we can talk about funding. You know, I probably like many of you grew up in California. My family moved here in the 1950s. We were actually in New York, and they moved here because my sister had asthma, and they were told that moving to Los Angeles would be good for asthma. This was back in the days when doctors would recommend Camel filters as being good for you. But we grew up in California. My dad, who was an immigrant, actually undocumented when he first arrived, was able to buy a house because there was a GI Bill that was a massive subsidy. There was a freeway system heading out through the San Gabriel Valley, so that's where we were able to grow up. I went to decent public schools because there was public investments in them, and I went to the University of California because people were paying for it so that the next generation could get ahead. You know, we are currently unwilling to pay, and I mean, I think we really have to confront the fact that we've benefited from a tremendous set of investments in infrastructure that's made my own productivity as a professor. You know, now I'm a tenured, full professor at USC, something that would be an even bigger achievement if I had season football tickets, but still, it's a pretty big thing, right? And I feel like I contribute, but I know that I owe it to a California that invested in a set of opportunities. And we need to step up. And that means we're going to need to step up on certainly making the government more efficient and more streamlined so people can do development the right way. But we're going to need to step up on the funding side as well. I graduated from UC Santa Cruz in 1978 when Prop 13 was passed. And because it was UC Santa Cruz, I was asked to be our college speaker, but they refused to put my name in the program because they didn't want any honors. And instead we did this like little guerrilla theater, and I emerged to give a speech about how Prop 13 was going to shipwreck the state because it was going to wind up shortchanging the resources we would need to invest, and that it was a declaration of generational warfare because it was going to protect older homeowners and make it really difficult for newer homeowners, and it protects older businesses, and it makes it more difficult for startup businesses who are paying full freight on what they pay. I mean, it's the third rail of politics, but it's really screwed up our fiscal system. It's created this fiscalization of land use, so we wind up chasing commercial property, commercial retail sales tax instead of industrial jobs that would actually generate wages or housing that makes sense. So I think it's a discussion that we're going to need to have in the next couple of years, and frankly, it's probably not popular in this audience. We need to raise revenues in the state, and I know that I'm part of the group that's going to be burdened with that increase in revenues, and I think it's appropriate given how much I've benefited from how an earlier generation was taxed, willing to sacrifice and pay, and create an infrastructure for me to succeed.
Yeah. So that's the last bomb we're going to throw, and we're going to ask for questions from the audience.
Somebody in the back there.
Well, I just want to ask a question on that investment. We say funding education. Aren't we, in terms of K through 12, on a per capita basis, compared with other states, one of the highest? So is it a lack of will to fund, or is it, what happens? Where is it leaking out?
No, we're actually, we're kind of creeping up, but we're still in the bottom kind of 6 or 7 in terms of our spending per student. So I think that we're underspending on education, and we're also, frankly, we've got we have a pretty high poverty rates in the state. That affects kids and their ability to perform in schools, and we're not spending what we're going to need to do to make sure that this next generation is productive. But no, the fact is that we're on the bottom of the spending side. Does that mean that spending alone will do it? No, we need accountability in schools. We need flexibility. People ought to be able to experiment with more creative public schools and more creative charters, et cetera. But it is not a fact that we are spending at the top of the states.
Different people throw different things into that number. So we had a construction boom in California. We built a lot of schools, and some people throw that number into the number of what we spend on schools, but it's not what we're spending on education. It's a different number.
So we've heard calls for cross-sector collaboration to really get this done. And if we go back to the question of, say, Prop 13, there has been a conversation over the last 2 years, maybe a little bit more, about how and perhaps to unravel that a little bit on the commercial property side. And yet it's not going to be on the ballot next year. One of the arguments that's been given for why it's not on the ballot is because of a desire to kind of divvy up where that money would go if it were coming back into the state's coffers by interest group, to be frank. So what strategies could we put in place to create the cross-sector political will for the kind of changes, the kind of investments, the kind of revenue shares that are needed in order to make this transformation possible, so that we can not have this conversation every year in a crisis mode, but rather in an opportunity mode?
Yeah, I mean, we did some of the research for the commercial property tax. The number that's come up, the potential for a $9 billion increase in revenues as a result of reform of the commercial property side of Prop 13 actually comes from the study that we did, which we tried to just be objective in that. And I think the reason it's not on the ballot, there's multiple reasons, including the fact that, you know, everybody wants to put their own favorite tax initiative on the ballot, and reforming Prop 13 is the most difficult one, so I think that's rough. I think my special plea in this particular audience is the following. When I'm with an audience of social justice advocates, I ask them to pay attention to the question of economic growth and how it is that you generate jobs, how it is that you work with the community college system, how it is that you generate career ladders, what is it that developers need to actually get something to pencil out if we want affordable housing, et cetera. In this particular audience, which is more of a business audience, my plea is get ahead of the issue on these questions of unequal opportunity and inequality. Some of you may be upset that Los Angeles is moving to a $15 an hour minimum wage. It probably wouldn't be if business had led on a more moderate increase and kind of head things off at the pass, right? Instead, things get a chance to sort of boil over till you wind up getting kind of extreme positions. Prop 13 being a very good example. We've let the dysfunction from Prop 13 get so awry that probably some of the schemes to fix it might be more extreme than any of us would agree on. I think in this particular, I mean, I'm really heartened to hear you all talking about what it is it's going to take to do affordable housing, how we need to recognize a balanced workforce, what it is we need to do to include sort of mixed income housing as part of the picture, right? I think business leadership on the issues of immigrant integration, social opportunity, and both more spending and educational reform, I think that's what's needed from this particular audience, so that we have a sense that we are all in it together, and then creating the avenues to have more productive conversations.
Yeah, I want to answer your cross-sector collaboration from a slightly different angle. So in the last year, the community colleges, we've embarked on a set of strong workforce reforms. And part of that conversation was to identify, if we made these changes to ourselves, then where will you step up, industry, in terms of your skin in the game? And so one of the conditions of the feedback from industry was that instead of we have 113 colleges. So in LA, instead of 18 colleges coming after us individually, we would like to have a regional sector approach where all of you come together, education come together as a whole, and your capacity comes together as a whole. That way the entertainment industry can come to the table, or the ITC sector can come to the table and engage at a more efficient level. So we are working on that redesign of our own system. Where the employers said they would step up is that if we did that, the employers would more actively think about work-based learning, as well as jobs, as well as advising curriculum early on, so that it's not a guessing game between the education sector and the training sector, right? We close the gap on that. And so, as you say, it's a multi-sector approach. We have to all step closer to each other in order to make the collaboration work.
And in those cases, they do give you equipment, and they do give you
That's right.
to teach the classes.
Mm-hmm.
You do sort of become part of the solution.
That's right.
And by the way, this is happening in other parts of the country. So in North Carolina, for example, the community college system is actively collaborating with Siemens to be able to devise classes that will actually feed into the manufacturing that Siemens is doing. There's a great story in this new book I just put out, which you should all buy,
Maybe not read, apparently, according to Kendall.
No, there's no need to read it, just buy it. But the book is called Equity, Growth, and Community. And we look at places where the sectors have come together, and they're sometimes surprising. One you might not be surprised by, but in San Antonio, for example, 2 years ago, the citizens of San Antonio passed a sales tax on themselves to fund pre-K for disadvantaged kids. The perhaps surprising thing was not that the mayor supported it or social justice groups, but the Chamber of Commerce, saying that this was a workforce development issue for 20 years. In the very red city or region of Oklahoma City, a series of 5 Republican mayors have supported tax increases to be able to revitalize the downtown and to revitalize their education system with a specific focus on places that had a lot of African Americans, to get the right kind of workforce and get the right kind of downtown to be able to bring people together. So there's instances of this conversation happening at a metropolitan or regional level. We need to kind of build that to the state.
It seems to me that we've had a tendency over the years to change our whole educational system. When I went to school years ago, in junior high school and high school, we had shop classes. We had electrical workshop, we had mechanical workshop, we had auto shop, all these kinds of things. Home ec, cooking classes. Well, today, the emphasis has been on getting into college specifically. You know, you take a science, a language, English, and these things. You got so many kids that have lived on the streets that basically I think what we've done is we've pushed them out of the schools onto the streets where they are not really equipped to enter into the job force unless it's to sell drugs or to get into crime or something like that. So I think we ought to take a look at our base of our educational system and try to figure out ways that technical, occupational types of classes can be made available to kids in high school and to the community colleges, just if nothing else, to keep them in school and off the streets where they have an opportunity to be engaged in something that they might like for themselves and something they would do.
We have seen a loss of those. I was education editor before I was managing editor, and we did stories about how SHOP has gone away. But actually, some schools, some public schools are bringing them back, and they're bringing them back very strategically, and they're bringing them back to teach certain skills. There was a school that I think, I may be wrong, but maybe Mary Plummer did a story about this, that had, they brought auto shop back, and there were cars in there, and they were fixing them.
Well, that's happening at Locke High School in South LA, but you know, the interesting thing about the example that you're offering, sorry to speak so much, but this is the other day I got a phone call from a young African-American man from Baltimore who is just finishing a master's program and wants to come and get a PhD at USC, maybe at the Price School. I was trying to talk him into sociology. Perfect. And he's very interested in the relationship between the built environment and the way in which people interact and how the built environment structures, and as developers you think about this a lot. He went to a high school focused on construction careers. And because it kept him engaged, he did super well. He went to college, he's gotten a master's, he's applying for a PhD. So sometimes I think we think that this is a tracking system, but it can be an engagement system that actually gets somebody into a 4-year program as well.
And I want to comment on that because I think that is a critical challenge that I am facing in my business today. And I don't know if Sean is the same. There is a severe labor shortage in California for the trades.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Framers, electricians, plumbers, they're not there. There are not enough people. Even though the starts are down here, there is still not enough labor force to build the homes. And I meet with all of our trade partners, and they truly are partners in our business. And I was talking to one of our framers, and he said, and this was very telling, he said to me, he goes, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, we framed your houses, and then our framers bought your houses. That no longer happens. And he said in the 70s and early 80s, I would pay my framers $20 an hour. He said, what do you think I'm paying them today? He said, I'm paying $22 an hour. And that was just a very telling. And by the way, as I went trade by trade, and you look at where those trades have recovered in this cycle, those incomes got pushed down. And while some material costs may have gone up in other areas, but those incomes haven't gone from $20 to $30. They're still at $20, $22. And we need those people, and I think that's part of the issue. For the kids in college today, they're not running to go be the electricians, the framers. You know, they want to be the next Kim Kardashian. But we need to build that workforce. And I think what you're doing on the education side, we're all linked. this whole group works
Right.
together.
So as a developer and as an employer, and you're seeing ahead that you're going to have a talent puddle, that is exactly the right place to be partnering with education up front. And you know, I came from the private sector side dealing with the pain points on recruiting talent. And when we started putting in place some of these workforce programs, we did focus groups with students to see, well, why are you or are you not interested in some of these really well-paying middle skill careers? And this was, for example, to become, for example, even though in the middle of the night, if your power goes out, who goes to fix your power line? That's a set of electrical, the line workers, right?
It's a good paying job.
Like, a very good paying job. They're all six-figure income. The feedback from the students were that they, what appealed to them about these careers wasn't that necessarily it was hands-on, but it wasn't confined in four walls. And that was a big insight to me. So if you can imagine, if they feel claustrophobic by the four walls of a cube or four walls of an office, imagine thinking that if there's only one path for them, then it's not interesting and appealing. But the moment that they see that there's all these other occupations that are very rewarding and productive, then they stay in school. So I think we have our own biases about these careers that we need to rethink. And again, when the employers stand with education, you're going to get high quality candidates from all communities coming into those programs in ways that education cannot do it alone.
Last question or two?
I'm seeing a lot of this, what Van talked about, these Uber drivers and young people that really feel like they manage their own schedule, their own bosses, they feel empowered. But I don't see a career path there, and I see the long-term kind of structural and unemployment numbers and projections looking daunting, particularly when we look at how many jobs will be taken over by ultimately AI and computers and whatnot. So what is a young person to do and think about today, and how, when we think about a workforce that an elementary school student might be graduating into, where computers are better at pretty much everything than they are? What do you guys think about in terms of long term?
Vaughn, do you want to take that? I mean, it's hands-on, right? I mean, that's where it is.
Well, for the creative economy, the transferable skill sets are always the 4 C's, right? So the critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. Right, so and those are the skill sets that drive the STEM economy. So I think when we think about skills, we think about those 4 C's, but also think about the specific technical skills. If you want to be a programmer and code or do data visualization, or any of the skill sets that we've talked before. The combination, the balance of the two is very important.
Just about a minute left. Last question. Someone have a mic? Yeah.
I wanted to thank you. I think this has been a very, very robust discussion here. My question is, it seems to me that the developers and asset managers are not getting it. How can you call $400,000 to $600,000 property affordable when we can barely get a $15 minimum wage? If salaries can't keep up with housing prices, how is that good for California? And shouldn't we be talking about reasonable and practical affordable housing?
Scott?
I'd love to talk about that. And again, I don't personally believe that's affordable. So we were the largest affordable home builder in the state. We partnered
Under
with
the redevelopment agencies.
We
yeah.
partnered with redevelopment agencies. We were the largest transit builder up and down the coast. Redevelopment agencies went away. In LA, you lost almost $250 million. That didn't go to 50 or 10, went to 0. And there's other avenues to provide affordable housing, as Sean was talking about in his project in Northern California. In Pasadena, with the density bonus, we provide affordable housing. We are a private business. We are a for-profit business. Our goal is to be able to provide affordable housing, but if I am to provide affordable housing, which would be in the $200,000 to $300,000 price range, the land does not exist to do that. It doesn't exist. I cannot go to you and say, you know what? I know your property's $5 million, but let's do this together for the right reasons. I'm going to pay you $1 million. And that is a quick conversation. They say, you know what? Sean's going to pay me $5 million. I'm going to sell it to Sean. We need cities, and the reason I'm able to do affordable units in Pasadena and Huntington Beach is those cities want to see affordable, and I think there is a stigma that does not exist in affordable. I have had no problem selling my $700,000 townhouse next to my $200,000 townhouse in Huntington Beach. But the city has to drive it. The council has to drive it. Pasadena, I mentioned this before, it's a playbook. There is not a regional playbook in this state on how to provide affordable housing and work with developers. Developers, at least our company, we want to do the right thing. We've been in business 28 years. We are a solution provider. On our website, it says we are trying to provide affordable housing. Some people call it workforce housing. There is no workforce housing. And affordable is a definition. Affordable in Pasadena, unfortunately, is $600,000. That is affordable in Pasadena.
Based on who's already living there, right? That's how those numbers.
I can't change it.
Yeah.
I can change that where I am selling in Pasadena a $300,000 product because that city wanted to work with me and create a 10% affordable component in that community through a density bonus.
You know, I think it's important to say the following thing. In the late 1980s, Pasadena passed the slow growth ordinance, and after it did, it was sued by its local chamber in the urban league because it wasn't going to be producing enough housing. The city decided to revise its general plan.
That's correct.
And the way that it revised its general plan was it took the money it was going to spend on consultants who would do the technical part, and instead it spent it on community outreach. I was actually part of that community outreach, and we took the minority community participation from 10% to 40% by the end of the process. About 2,000 or 3,000 people went through a conversation about the future of Pasadena. Business folks, renters, homeowners, people were forced to meet neighbor to neighbor in order to understand what the future would be for the city as a whole, and that laid the template for that playbook that you're working with right now. There's an expression in the United States that talk is cheap because we value action, but talk is not cheap. Getting people to converse together about what the future looks like requires time, it requires energy, it requires organizing, and then it can lay out a path that makes it easier for you to do the work that you do.
Well, that's a good note for us to end on.
We're not building out there.
Someone's going on the freeway. We're about 3 minutes over. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Sean.